James Baxter, and yeah, I guess I'll just start. Note: this diary was found on the ship HMS Asphodel after it returned to the Gravesend docks completely deserted in January 1880. Intended to carry goods to the Americas, the ship seemed undamaged apart from one room, assumed to be where Elise Baxter stayed. It was here that the diary pages were found, along with broken pieces of a glass tank and a great deal of blood. The diary pages found were returned to the Baxter family, whose daughter had gone missing the year before. Diary of Elise, this name has been crossed out, James Baxter. Thursday, 22nd of February, 1878. Miserable day. The clouds are clasped around the ship like hungry, grasping hands, pulling at the rigging and sails until they are grey and heavy with damp. The wood around me creaks as it swells with moisture, and I can't help thinking of my lungs when I contracted bronchitis at 6, thick and wet with mucus, every breath constricted. My lungs have been weak ever since. It has been a week on the ship, and though I can't do much to help with heavy lifting, I have stitched up a couple of the crew who sliced their hands open yesterday. I stress the importance of keeping the wounds clean, but given the tar, salt and dirt of the general environment, I don't hold out much hope. I shall follow up on them tomorrow. Stayed inside, out of the chill today, in the little cabin I paid for. That means, until I go to eat, I can lock the door and let my chest breathe for a few hours. I try to keep the bandages loose and simply wear the thick wool greatcoat I secreted away months ago, but there is soreness and redness around my breasts that may, unless I take care in the future, bloom into bruising. Note this for future reference. What would Mother think of me? Monday, 26th of February, 1878. I did not sleep well. The wind was hassling at the sails as though some petulant child was grabbing desperately for something they could not reach. The echoing wails hauled up older sounds from the depths, my parents worrying as I pressed my ear to my bedroom wall, then whispering as their carefully constructed timeline for my life scattered like feathers from a split cushion. Unable to rest, I returned to the shelf that served as my desk and began to arrange the little leather roll of tools my father snuck beneath my pillow: my scalpel, hook, scissors, thick catgut and thin thread, the week after I was barred from his workshop after turning 15. While stuck in inane etiquette lessons under the diamond-cut glare of my mother, I remembered helping my father dissect specimens brought to him by scientist acquaintances. I had slim, nimble fingers and could get into the guts of fish, small sharks from the Americas, anything fragile my father needed taking apart. I remembered, as teacups slipped between my hands and puffed, crinkling sleeves kept my arms stiff, learning how the layers of skin, fat, and muscle came apart, going by texture, tension, poking apart fibers and scales. I could touch it as I could not snatch a wayward compliment from the air, or catch the smell of flesh preserved poorly in a way I could not sense my mother's conversation turning sour. When in the drawing room, dusted with afternoon sun, I did not feel quite like a person anymore, instead like a doll, posed and perfect. Nothing could be touched except with the brush of a duster. Cold disconnect bled from my mother, except when she looked at me. The afternoon sunlight faded as her head eclipsed the window. Her hair transformed into the warm gold she wished I had inherited, and all of the needling discomfort of the dress and the conversation faded. She was smiling at me as I held my teacup correctly. I had done well. I would make something of myself beyond. Here her whole face twisted, as if a stitch at the corner of her mouth had been pulled. Bothering your father. The smell of formaldehyde and the acidic tang of fermented stomach contents was something I summoned from those warm, blue-tinted memories of my father's study whenever I needed comfort. It comforts me now, fiddling with my tools and remembering how big my father's tools felt in my child's fingers. Those wooden handles left splinters and calluses warring across my pale hands. My mother had carefully bound them, extracting a promise that I would keep my hands scar-free, that I should never touch things that would hurt me. I didn't understand. My father's hands were covered in scars, small, shiny burns scattered like coins across his left palm. Shallow, pale lines notched his knuckles, and there was a permanent, ink-stained callus on the inside of his right index finger. He would sit, crouched over his desk, the very picture of scrupulous focus, and scrawl his findings and theories in shorthand to be copied out neatly later. His hands were his. They carried his life upon them. I could have identified his palms, his long fingers, even if blindfolded, I am sure of it. My mother's hands I recognized only by the cuffs of her favourite lambskin gloves, and nothing more. I remember examining the blank canvas of my healed hands, and once again thought of the porcelain skin of dolls, unmarred and cold. It was then, I think, that the idea of this mad plan began to germinate in my mind, a private promise made only to myself that I would not let myself remain blank to soak up whatever man my mother was inevitably moulding me for, letting myself fade like unused notepaper. I would handle any tools I wished. I would leave my mark on this world that sought to consume me. Wednesday, 28th of February, 1878. Wasn't going to write much this week, nothing except a calm sea and the lingering grey of rain clouds. But we found something. I had seen strange creatures, taxidermied, in museums that my father had taken me to in the past, ostensibly for fancy meetings with suitable young men, the venue's compromises between my mother's ambitions and my father's arguments for his own career. I dared not interject, and thankfully my mother read my intense stare and nervous hand-wringing as excitement or anxiety at potential suitors. I was anxious enough to spend the night before pacing my room, but when we arrived, my father put one arm around me and I grasped onto his hand like a much younger girl. The men at the party had eyes like marbles, shiny and bright, but showing no emotion. They looked at me as though I had been dissected by someone clumsy, slit open and spilling my guts down my front like a flailing tea splash. I do not remember what I said to them, if I managed to speak at all. I found familiar comfort in the creatures behind the glass, reading about them later at home. Bright birds with feathers vibrant as paints, monkeys frozen mid-scramble, a perpetually sad staring tiger. But it was the sea creatures, ones I had never seen before, that fascinated me most. There had been an expedition to explore the deep sea that had returned 6 months ago, and a few of the drawings had been reproduced for the purpose of distribution. One caught my eye, something like a flower, but at the top of the stalk sat a collection of soft tendrils, not pick-apart petals falling in the summer breeze. I imagined, for a moment, plucking it from the ocean floor, bringing it up out of the brine, watching it unfold, sensing the air on its diaphanous skin for the first time. Even after we returned home, the looming shapes of sharks, obsidian eyes shining in the dark, haunted my dreams, broken up by shimmering scales and shells bright as the aurora. The undersea flower grew through my tattered dream scraps, twining into a fluttering, fragile thicket that blanketed my sleep. The week after the meeting at the museum, I snuck down to the docks to buy a fish, politely gagging on the stench, and dissected it with a paper knife and one of my father's scalpels. Without the direction of his steady voice, I remember the feel of cold, viscous fluid on my hands, the layers of flesh and scale separating under my careful incisions. Its gills were fascinating and delicate from the outside, as though the slats of a fan had been encased in skin, But when I removed the head and peered inside, among the gobs of fat and bone, the gills unfurled like the petals of some foreign flower, retaining an internal dampness, shining in the lamplit pool of my desk. I remember thinking of the motion these gills should have held. We found it, caught on the rudder. I say we, meaning Paul throwing vegetable scraps overboard early this morning, who yelled out to the rest of us, waking the whole crew. I rushed to pull on a shirt that would hide my bound breasts, and ran out into the damp, shivering morning. Part of its tail had been caught up on the rudder, its delicate fins shredded, and lower tailbones broken like a dog's leg under a carriage. The creaking of the boat overwhelmed its desperate wails as it tried to escape, scraping its talons against the metal and lodging loose scales in the wood of the rudder. Paul and Simon, with the captain's direction, unhooked the creature from the rudder and transferred it to a net. I ran back to my cabin to grab a vial of chloroform and a rag. Pressing the fabric against its sharp face, I felt its snarling lips slacken and its struggling limbs go limp, its gills fluttering, at first frantic, but quickly subdued. It took Paul and me 2 hours, but by the time the sun glared through my open cabin door, we had cobbled together a tank from glass terrariums I had intended for stuffed or live specimens. The creature lay on my bed, still insensate, its gills fluttering softly as it breathed. I was glad it had survived, and surprised that it continued to breathe after it was hauled from the ocean. But it had not come up unmarked. In the time it had been sleeping, blue-black bruising had rapidly spread across the lower half of its tail. Together, Paul and I lifted the creature and deposited it into the makeshift tank. I poured in an inch of salt water, having noticed the paling of the fringes around its gills that, in marine reptiles at least, indicated dehydration. For now, its head lolled against its chest, its long hair twisting into an anemone-like mass. I sent Paul away and turned my full attention to the sleeping creature. I had seen false mermaids in museums and collections before, either as examples of fraudulent taxidermy or misidentified as evolutionary marvels. This, however, was real. I felt it breathe, scales shifting under my fingers as I traced the swollen gashes the collision with the ship had left in its side. Cleaning my hands and taking up my tweezers, I began gently pulling stray splinters of wood from the wounds, feeling the muscles beneath its scaled skin twitch in response to the tugging pain. I saw its eyelids flutter and its hair wind around itself as though possessed by a storm or a serpent. It awoke in a spluttering struggle, a pulsing, gulping motion that shuddered through its whole body, from its twisting hair to its thrashing bloody tail. It snarled, seemingly involuntarily, revealing layers of yellow teeth nested like pine needles in its mouth. Then it began to cough, a gruff, stony hacking that made its gills scratch and scrape against each other. I hurriedly pulled it up by the shoulders, feeling the muscles of its arms and back tense. Once it was sat up, I tried to check its gills for any blockage. I pushed its mouth away from me with one hand, and, as gently as I could, used my paper knife to separate the delicate films of its gills, carefully examining each layer of cartilage. Lamplight diffused, turning warm and green-tinted through each gill, and, as the creature shivered beneath my fingers, I remembered extracting small stones from the stomachs of fish, arranging them proudly on my windowsill. That same softness of touch, albeit with the trouble of something full of thrashing life beneath my hands, dragged out a bloody length of waxed twine from beneath the gills. It sent spiraling streams of blood across the both of us, the creature's eyes catching on the sudden spurt of motion before it lunged forward and bit me. Swearing, I pulled my hand away and shoved it against my shirt to stem the blood flow. In its tank, the creature shoved itself against one side and began to paw at its gills, then gently lick at its neck with a long, dark tongue. I decided I should let it be for a while, and instead turned my attention to the bite on my hand, which began at the base of my thumb and extended in a rough scarlet circle across my palm. It was shallow enough that it would not need stitches, so I hissed through my teeth as I cleaned the wound and bandaged my hand. I would have to be careful. There was no knowing what infections this undersea creature carried. I was hesitant to call it a mermaid. For one, I did not know its sex, and there is established evidence for fish being fluid in that area. What if it could be like me? Further examination will be required. For now, I need to sleep. I am exhausted from the day's physical exertion, and my brain is swarming with too many thoughts to properly sort through. I will unbind my chest if I remember, before I fall. Thursday, 1st of March, 1878. Apologies for the abrupt ending. I fell asleep at my desk, and fear my hair may have served as poor blotting paper. I forgot to unbind my chest, and the bruising has spread across my ribs, grey and purple as the ocean. I thought for a moment that some magic had occurred in my sleep, some transformation to keep my chest flat as a calm sea before I remembered. I struggled not to wince if I moved too fast, and subsequently loosened the bandages around my chest. The creature, the mermaid, I suppose, was watching me as I slept. I felt its eyes on me and heard it shift in its tank. When I moved to return its gaze, it seemed fascinated by the wall across from it. I was glad to see its gills looked more lively. A green flush suffused them all the way to the edges, where the thin cartilage resembled the underside of mushrooms, found with pale, delicate lines. I realized they blended into the pale underside of its throat, and then noted I had not truly examined its face in my hurry to clean its wounds. Now, I could see that its hair was much like a sea anemone, a pale, translucent mane of fronds through which I could see the dark silhouette of its skull. In the morning light, I could see the gentle gradient of blue-green that constantly shifted through the slithering mass. I truly did want to touch it, to run my hands through its hair as though to soothe an anxious animal. Then the mermaid turned to look at me, and I realized her eyes were opaline, slick with pale colours and the damp shine of vitreous fluid. But no, they were deep, cobalt blue. No, orange as the marigolds and dandelions in jars around my mother's room. No. The mermaid had multiple sets of eyelids. That was it. She blinked, and the soft, slick sound echoed thrice, and I was sure, to protect her eyes against the deep-sea pressure so they would not burst like eggs. Hesitantly, I moved closer, and she put a hand, webbed, I noticed, the same filmy green as her gills, against her neck, a protective motion. I did not know how to tell her that I only meant well, and instead took careful note of her movements. I moved my injured hand forward, realizing that it had bled a little through the bandage while I slept, and she opened her mouth, testing her layers of teeth against her scaled fingers. She seemed to realize that she had hurt me, her eyes flickering between bright blue and the swirling opal, and gestured for me to come closer. She could beckon. She had some knowledge of human gestures then. She shifted her head to the side, her soft fronds of hair spilling over one bulging eye, tendrils of it splitting and obscuring her flattened nose. I was close enough to lean over one side of the tank, hearing her breathing, seeing her gills flutter like petals in a spring breeze. She clutched one hand around my wrist, and as she moved, I saw that her whole body was lined with fins from the base of her ribcage, each carrying flowing blue-green markings down to her dark, shining tail. The shortest fins at her ribs fluttered in time with her gills, and I wondered if those slitted, vulnerable gills continued from her neck to beneath her ribs. How did her lungs work? How was she amphibious? The mermaid looked me in the eye then, and for a moment, in the dark flicker of her eyelids, I saw my own pale face, marked with ink from sleeping on my diary. My unevenly cut hair, the loose bandages around my chest, lending the cast of a corpse recently disinterred. My mother was wrong. I was never pure. The mermaid took my injured hand in her mouth. Her lips were cold and her tongue slick against my wrist. Twisting her head to one side like a dog, she pulled off the bloody bandage and swallowed it. She began to lick the bite mark she had left. Her tongue was as dark as her tail, emerging from her mouth like a sleeping monster from within a cave. I did not pull my hand away. She seemed pleased. The fluttering of her gills turned steady, and I realized, after a moment, that it was matching the beating of my pulse. She could feel it in my wrist, after all.